Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to find podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. This week, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Emily Zanotti, contributing editor here at Acton. This week, we'll be discussing the recent ruling by the Alabama State Supreme Court that implicates IVF treatment and Pope Francis's comments on the ongoing war in Ukraine. But first, on Thursday, President Joe Biden delivered his State of the Union address. We are not, as people listening will know, a political podcast, so we're not going to break down all the political implications of this. Only that I will say it's a little hard to avoid some of the political implications of this because it effectively was a campaign speech that he gave. I think we've been trending in this direction for a little while now. State of the Unions kind of always were this ridiculous list of every possible policy and every spending initiative that they could think of that they wanted to throw out there with, again, occasional announcements of or reinforcements of major policy propositions, particularly having to do with foreign policy, which is where Joe Biden started with the war in Ukraine. Of course, we will be visiting that in a later topic. The speech accomplished what was probably the primary goal of people around Joe Biden, which was he got through the whole thing and was upright at the end of it. It has become a very weird and bizarre spectacle, an even weirder and more bizarre spectacle than it had been in recent years, both with certain members of Congress dressing up in bizarre ways. You may have seen Marjorie Taylor Greene wearing a MAGA hat on the floor. There was one congressman wearing a T-shirt with Donald Trump's mugshot from when he surrendered in Atlanta. And then, of course, you have the Kabuki theater that is the Speaker of the House and the Vice President sitting behind the president. And nobody really knows what kind of facial expression to make at what point in time. I can only imagine as a member of Congress or somebody in the gallery how exhausting the State of the Union experience must be. Like, do I smile? Do I stand? Do I seem to agree with this? I agree with this, but it's the bad guy who's saying it. So can I seem like I'm agreeing with it? So that is just the general take. And if anyone has any reactions to President Biden's State of the Union, please, of course, feel free to throw those in. But I want to ask a different question based on what I found weird about the ritual that happens every year, which is the president comes down and announces that the state of this union is strong. And in every campaign event that President Biden will do, he is going to say that democracy is under threat, that the republic is about ready to fall if we elect the wrong guy, which makes it a little hard to say that it's as he said, strong and getting stronger, but also democracy is about to end. It's a little hard for me to marry those two things together. So I would just rather get a sense from the panelists here on this august podcast. I'll start with you, Dan. What is the state of our union?
I mean, the state of our union is what we make of it. And I am here in my little.
The state of the union is the friends we made along the way.
So this is and you point out there's these weird tensions in this speech. There is a major thread line through the State of the Union is that democracy is under threat from, quote unquote, my predecessor. President Trump is, in fact, never named in the State of the Union address. What's very interesting, though, is the norms that are violated on the way to get there. President Biden was not introduced by the Speaker of the House, which is the custom. This custom has been violated before in 2019 with President Trump's State of the Union address. Then Speaker Pelosi did not introduce him. But then you also have this strange moment in the speech where President Biden singles out the Supreme Court with the threat of Democratic intimidation and repercussions to their decisions, which, as all of us who have been through, Civics 101 knows, is sort of the court is supposed to be the aristocratic element of American government that is insulated from the democratic aspects of our governing regime. So this is a very strange way to go about securing democracy, is to, delegitimize both the House that is supposed to represent the people, not only through not allowing Speaker Johnson to introduce him, but also like casting aspersions that the House is somehow beholden to President Trump and acting on his directives and not in the interests of the people. And that's the sort of thing that, if you're talking about on the Sunday morning political, slugfest shows, that's okay to speculate, I think. I think that's fair grounds to speculate. It's very different coming from the leader of a democratic government that is casting aspersions on what's known as the People's House. And what he did with the Supreme Court, I think, is equally sort of reprehensible. So there's all sorts of other sort of theatrical aspects of this. The State of the Union is denigrated, from what was once, something delivered on paper to what became sort of an infomercial for America that transitioned into an infomercial for, whoever was president at the time, and is now, I think, a campaign speech, as you rightly observed. But more concerning, I think, are these norm-breaking things around sort of the context of the State of the Union and how the president relates to the other branches of government.
Emily, what is the state of our union?
I try to be as optimistic as possible. I think the state of our union is obnoxious, actually.
Is that the optimistic take?
I guess that's the optimistic take. So I think I agree with Dan when I think we've come to see the State of the Union as almost inconsequential. Like it's just a rah-rah, everything's going great, everything is wonderful sort of speech. And we stand up and we sit down and it's all very performative. But what you don't really see is your grocery prices going up and your fuel prices going up and the prices of commodities going up. And it's odd because it's sort of, I think maybe back 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I started in politics, the State of the Union was this big event and everyone had a drinking game or they would go to a restaurant and sit and watch it with their friends. And now it just sort of seems like a joke. It's on cable TV, so I don't even see it because I would have to turn off my streaming networks to see it. So I think it just feels a little bit like a relic of the past. And we're in this era where we're all on teams and we have to believe in a certain set of ideals. And so it just sort of becomes this kind of overly performative act, I think, now than it really is a policy discussion. And I would love to see them hash out policy on the floor and maybe beat each other with sticks like they did in the days leading up to the Civil War. But I don't think that that's going to happen.
Ah, yes, the good old days. Yeah, so I'll answer the same question, but I'm going to change the phrasing of it because I do think we need to modernize these things a little bit. I don't want to give the State of the Union. I want to give the vibes of the Union. And I think the vibes are weird. That's about the best that I can say. That's my optimistic take, to borrow from Emily, is that the vibes are really weird. We're not we're about, again, moving into an election where the biggest conversation in most presidential elections is usually about the undecideds or the independents and who's going to win the undecided voters, who's going to win the independent voters. And there's this phrase that has really I've been hearing a lot the last couple of weeks. It's about the double haters. The double haters are the ones who are going to decide this election. And those are people who hate both of the nominees, but will probably pick one at the end of the day. So I think just that alone is weird. A lot of the stuff that, Dan, you highlighted of the continually discarding norms around this kind of stuff is not good and is pretty weird. We've had presidents lashing out at the Supreme Court previously. I think this only highlights, and we're going to talk about this in a moment here, that it is a problem in the way that we think about the judicial system and the judicial branch. And that because Congress largely is not doing its job, they keep tossing all of these hot potato problems over to the Supreme Court. And they're like the Kenan Thompson bit from Saturday Night Live, where they just kind of look at the Supreme Court and go, fix it. And in a lot of cases, the Supreme Court can't fix this, right? They answer questions. They don't really solve cases. And there's a lot of questions that are coming up to the Supreme Court that you can really see, that there was analysis of John Roberts' decisions, particularly near the end of the Trump administration, where it was just like John Roberts is very done with the Trump administration. And you can make a very credible argument that that's not the best way for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to be deciding cases, but it's also a fairly human way for people to be deciding cases. Just be like, we're like enough of this stuff. This is where I have to play. I'm obliged to play my album side, and I will drop the piece that I wrote a couple years ago into the show notes. Dan alluded to this as well. The State of the Union should not exist in the form that it currently exists. It was, starting really with Thomas Jefferson, a written document that was delivered to Congress. There were in-person presentations of it prior to that. Jefferson turns it into a written document that is presented to Congress. And like most terrible things in American political or governmental life, it is revived by Woodrow Wilson, turned into the kind of spectacle that it is now. And I have to reserve some opprobrium for the kind of cloying nature of a lot of this way that the State of the Union is done for a president that I have a lot of admiration and respect for, in Ronald Reagan, because Reagan was the one who first started doing like the little anecdote stories and pointing to the person in the gallery. At least I'm pretty sure he was the first one to do that. And it was very effective. And that's the reason that you've continued to see these things be used over and over again. But I mean, overall, I'm just now waiting for the point in time where a president will do what I think everybody half expects them to do at the State of the Union, which is finally come out and just say, the State of the Union isn't good. Like, we got some problems. And you got this from some candidates in the Republican primary, most notably Vivek Ramaswamy, who pushed back on the idea that the country's in a good place. If it's a State of the Union, again, I think we can answer somewhere along the lines of what Dan said, that it's kind of what we make of it, that this is an opportunity to remind people that things are, for the people who focus constantly on what is going on in Washington, you would be forgiven for thinking things are pretty terrible. But most people are, with problems like inflation affecting them, there are definitely issues that need to be addressed. One of the proposals that was brought up in President Biden's State of the Union was a $5,000 credit that is going to be offered to first-time home buyers. And it's not going to fix the supply problem if you just continue to subsidize demand there. So, I mean, on one sense, at least, like we're getting something policy oriented, but it's like the worst possible way that we're getting it. So these things actually do affect people's lives. People, who would like to buy a home, who like here in Grand Rapids, I believe the occupancy rate is somewhere like 97%.
Subsidizing demand is sure to help that.
Is not going. It's like it's literally the meme of like I just need to subsidize demand. Everything will be fine. I just need to subsidize demand.
It's going to make a huge disaster in places like Nashville, where the occupancy rate is lower than the availability rate is lower than the number of people looking.
Yeah.
Like I could never possibly if I did that. I mean, I would drive my home price up. It's already incredibly inflated, and it would drive my home price up even higher for buyers who can't afford it. It would certainly take all of the it would drive the 60-year residents of this neighborhood out, probably, because then you start to get home values that are way overshot. It's just such a would you do this? I don't know. The other thing, going back to something that you said about having someone who said the State of the Union is actually terrible, I think now we're also conditioned to see that almost as I hate to use the term, but grifting.
Yeah.
Like everything now is terrible. You hear someone like Vivek Ramaswamy say, "Oh, the State of the Union is terrible," and really, what they're trying to do is scare you into voting for something that's so markedly different. And so unbelievably weird on the other end, this sort of horseshoe theory that comes around. So when I hear that, oh, the State of the Union is terrible, I think about actually, I do live in a very nice place and I can afford 2 cars and a home, and I'm a millennial homeowner, which is very rare. Like, I think that we are conditioned now to see every comment on this as fake.
Yeah, Emily makes a good point, so I'll interject 2 things. One, I think it would be incorrect for a president to come out and say the State of the Union is terrible. I don't actually believe that it's terrible. Like, again, my answer is that the vibes are weird, but it's not terrible. We are in this kind of weird place where I think Emily did a good job of highlighting this, where people's reaction is to think that, like, my own individual life is fine. Like, things are generally going pretty well. But we have this concern for but it's bad for everybody else. It's this, it's kind of similar to the effect of I hate Congress, but I love my individual congressman. Like, the whole thing is bad, but the individual person I'm sending there, but everybody thinks that the person that they're sending there is great, but the collective is really bad. So we have this disconnect between how we view what is within our own kind of personal sphere versus how we view how things are going in an enormous country of 330 million people, where we just think things are much worse for everybody else than they actually are for us. So again, I don't think it's terrible, but what I would appreciate is, something in between terrible and coming out and saying that the state of our union is strong and getting stronger. Like there's a middle ground there that I think is a little bit more honest about how we're all feeling right now. It's like, look, we've got some significant problems. Things haven't been going fantastically great for the last 15 or 20 years. We should do some stuff about that, but it's still the greatest country in the world, and there's still the place where people want to come and live. So I think we could find, I'm honestly looking for some honesty from whoever would answer that question.
Yeah, I'm honestly looking for someone who said, yeah, this is a problem, we're trying to fix it.
Yes.
I see this a lot when I tell people I live in a city. They're like, oh my God, you live in a city? Is it horrible? No, it's not. Crime here is high, but it's in very specific places. And I think this happens in a lot of cities. Chicago, Detroit, New York. We hear a lot about the worst possible things. And part of that is marketing in terms of media. If it leads, it leads. So you see a lot more of the worst now. But I would love somebody to say, actually, illegal immigration right now is a problem. I, for one, believe that people should come here. But I also believe we can't just take in 300,000 people every month through certain checkpoints and rely on our cities to absorb that without infrastructure. And I think you would just like to hear somebody say, this is a problem, but we're working on it, maybe.
This could have been a very, very different State of the Union address. President Biden's administration has had real accomplishments during this term. Inflation has been essentially dealt with through the actions of the Federal Reserve. You had terrible price rises that are still very recent in people's memories, but this is a very strong economy with rising wages, with record-breaking stock market valuations. If President Biden had chosen to accentuate the positive, we would have a very different picture. But as Emily's right, this is if it bleeds, it leads mentality. And thus we have him obsessing about conspiracies overseen by his predecessor, an imperiled democracy, a court that is engaged in a war against women. This is not what this speech has to be about. This is his choice to turn it into the player haters ball. And when you do that, Buck Nasty will yell at you from the floor because that's the environment that you're encouraging. Now, this isn't President Biden's sole responsibility or fault, but he is the man on the podium for that hour, 2 hours. Oh, well, it might be 3 hours. And he is responsible for setting the tone there.
Yeah, I want to move on to our next topic, but I'll say one more thing. That is the one of the ways of analyzing how our politics works, and utilizing game theory as a way of doing it. This constant reinforcing. I think you were talking about norms. One of the biggest problems of norm violations is not just the norm violation in and of itself. It's the way that it creates a permission structure for people to continue to violate other norms or start violating other norms in response to it. It is, I think, a kind of similar thing that of what you were describing there, Dan, where it's like it continues to give permission for us to consider these things to be worse and worse and worse without actually doing about it. And I would really love to see somebody just doing the kind of thing that I would expect from almost a parental capacity, which is at some point, somebody has to start acting like the adult. You have to start acting like what you would want to see, even if in the short term, it's like, you're agreeing to play by rules that the other side is supposedly not playing by. But at some point, you just have to be the example of how you would like things to work, and continually saying, well, now they've given me permission to disregard all of these other rules is the kind of thing that just continues on a spiral down. So I'd like to see some people trying to act differently, but we may have to keep waiting for that. I want to move on to our second topic. I'm going to read here from the Morning Dispatch newsletter from February 27, so backing up a little bit in time here. Republican politicians have had quite a time in the last 10 days grappling with the effects of the Alabama Supreme Court's decision legally protecting embryos under the state's wrongful death statute, which prompted an in vitro fertilization facilities in the state to pause treatment. Tommy Tuberville, for example, the senior senator from Alabama, first expressed wholehearted approval of the decision, while also saying he supported IVF. When asked about the effect of the decision on women currently in the middle of IVF treatment, he told Semaphore, quote, "I don't know enough about how that works." Finally, on Friday afternoon, the senator endorsed a move to legally protect IVF treatment. Much to the chagrin of some pro-life advocates hoping to reform the IVF process, Tuberville's evolution over the past week has been largely representative of elected Republicans' efforts to distance themselves from any suggestion of restricting or banning IVF treatment. Democrats, seeing a political opportunity, have attempted to paint the Alabama's decision as a consequence of the Supreme Court's Dobbs ruling in 2022. But as with most hot-button court decisions, the devil is in the details. So what has happened since this ruling? The legislature in Alabama has passed legislation, and the governor has signed it, that protects IVF. One of the things that stood out to me, so with any major legal events, the place that I turn to for understanding them better is the Advisory Opinions podcast that the Dispatch publishes. I'll put a link to the episode that really first addresses this, and that's with Sarah Isger and David French. And one of the things that stood out to me, and which is why I wanted to discuss this topic here, as kind of David French pointed out, that a lot of people on the pro-life side had not clearly had not thought a lot of this through on what the implications of their success in something like Dobbs would be. Now, this is, again, as I understand it, Emily is the lawyer person here, so she can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but Dobbs really doesn't have a whole lot to say about what this case was. This was the state Supreme Court in Alabama reading a statute from the 1800s, saying what the implications of it were, and then the legislature responding to all of that. But I think David makes, and other people who have said this make a good point, which is people within the pro-life movement, one, there are some divides once you got past the abortion question and you get into something like IVF. And David's point, again, generally was that people had not thought IVF through. And I thought, considering that we had an entirely Catholic panel on this podcast today, and you can credibly accuse the Catholics of a lot of things, but we certainly have thought through things like IVF. So, Emily, I'll go to you on either any of the legal aspects of this, but certainly the understanding that Catholics can bring to questions about IVF.
Sure. So I wrote about this for Deseret, and as well as did an interview with our Sunday Visitor on both of these things. I actually struggled with infertility, and we avoided IVF because the Catholic stance is against basically the commodification of reproduction. So we have a very specific stance on IVF, and that is there is no permissible way to create babies in a lab. You cannot take the ovum from a woman and the semen from a man, create a child, and then implant that child. There will always be an implication there. You cannot mess with that, the natural order of things in the Catholic Church. And actually, I think that that's the most consistent, the most ethically consistent, the most morally consistent position on all of this. But getting back to the question of law here, it actually is really interesting because this didn't start out as a question of whether an embryo has personhood. It is a question of what happens when an embryo gets destroyed against the wishes of the parents. So in this case, there was an IVF clinic. There were some malfeasance. There was some malfeasance by the staff, and a bunch of embryos that were on ice were defrosted and died. And the question is, what is lost when you create life and then it gets destroyed by accident? And the Supreme Court of Alabama and the lower courts in Alabama were asked to decide whether defrosting an embryo without the permission of the parents who partook in this IVF process constitutes wrongful death, because the parents wanted to recover against the IVF clinic. So essentially, they were asking whether when you defrost an embryo, is it a person for the purpose of them being able to sue the IVF clinic for wrongful death or wrongful harm? Or is it property? Do you have a lost property, or do you have sort of speculative damages? Even if these embryos were going to be on ice forever, do you have a loss of potential reproductive rights or potential ability to conceive a child? What is lost when something like this happens? And the Alabama courts decided that what is lost is life. And from there, a wrongful death lawsuit can proceed. So that started the ball rolling down the hill. It really never touched the idea of Dobbs. It never touched abortion. It never touched the issue of life. And we have very similar situations with murder 1 and murder 2 when it comes to unborn humans. So when you kill a pregnant lady and the fetus or the baby also dies, the intent to kill the woman then transfers to the baby. So, Lacey Peterson, Scott Peterson, was charged with 2 murders because she was pregnant with an 8-month-old baby at the time. So we have this in other aspects of the law. Where does personhood come in? We also have, sort of imagined personhood or corporate personhood. So we have lots of different ways to define personhood under the law. And in this case, it's about damages. But it did start the ball rolling down the hill, and a lot of people in IVF clinics were saying, now we can't do IVF. We can't store these embryos indefinitely. We're going to need new legal paperwork. We're going to need a new legal foundation, because the question becomes what happens when these embryos die. So it involves a lot of different issues, but in this case, it is the legal ramifications of killing an embryo against the wishes of the parent.
People often forget that the pro-life movement is a political movement. And they forget it because a lot of what draws people into the pro-life movement are either religious convictions of conscience or strongly held philosophical beliefs about where life begins, these sorts of things, matters of justice. But as Emily has very thoughtfully pointed out here, is when the rubber hits the road concerning legislation, this is a political process. And this is one that involves legislation. This involves deciding all sorts of things, not in terms of a religiously informed anthropology, not in terms of a rigorous philosophical consistent position, but this involves the messy question of statutes and of all of the sort of common law underpinnings of a lot of our legal discourse. And what this Alabama situation reveals is how folks haven't come to terms with this. People haven't come to terms, I think, Eric, you're right in observing people haven't come to terms with exactly what do I believe. A lot of people just have never thought this through because they grew up in a world in which the question was, should this be a world in which abortion is essentially available on demand, or should it be one in which restrictions are possible? And now we live in a world in which those restrictions are possible, and we have to come to terms with how those get enacted in state law and what those implications will be. And we'll see divisions within the pro-life movement itself about this question, because the pro-life movement itself, although it was animated in many cases by religious conscience, philosophical conviction, it's a political coalition. And those people actually have very different views at times about these issues.
Well, even the implication of different religious traditions within that movement have different views on this specific topic, which is one of the reasons I wanted to highlight the Catholic viewpoint on this, because there is a body of thought, which is not to suggest, I don't want to suggest that other, denominations have not thought this through in any meaningful way. To a great extent, they have. It's a question of, even within the Catholic Church, of how well they have done in terms of educating people and imparting that view on it. But Dan, you make an incredibly important point here, which is one that where I found myself arguing with a lot of people over time, which is you can achieve a momentary political victory that is damaging to your long-term interests. So some of the arguments, be they from they would have been proto-neo-integralists at the time, because integralism hadn't really hit its stride yet to the extent that it has. But the view that I often heard from this kind of group of people was, I'm in favor of banning all abortion to the extent that I can, no matter how we achieve it, more or less. And the problems that flow from that, I think, should be fairly obvious, that if you're going to, within a structure of government like the one we have, if you're going to make moves that are going to provoke a backlash that is actually going to move the progression of policy in the other direction rather than incrementally in the direction you would like to see it go, then is that really in your interest? And I understand where this gets tough and complicated for people, because you're talking about human life, and the argument would be anything that you can do to preserve innocent life, to stop it from being ended, is a good thing. But unless you're going to, I suppose, achieve the integralist dream of completely refashioning and remaking the structure of government that we have in this country, Well, this is the system in which you're playing. And this is the way that you have to think about these things, because you can have backlashes. This is a reason why you're going to have, there's largely a consensus about when this is not a all throughout pregnancy pro-life nation. It is just not. But you have almost universal agreement that it should be very restricted, and if not almost impossible in the third trimester. And we're a little more undecided on the second, and just generally speaking, as a populace, are fairly in favor of it in the first. We may, in the three of us individually, other people with faith convictions may not like that answer, but politically, that is where the country is. And we have to operate based on that reality. And you want to try to move people along, but that is going to take time. And the more aggressive that you sometimes try to move them along, the bigger the backlash is going to be in the end.
So I also think that there's a cultural aspect to this. Our approach to having children has changed very dramatically in the latter half of the 20th century and the early parts of the 21st. We've gone from thinking of children as necessary because we had farms and we had homesteads and we needed to do this, to the idea of children as being a luxury good. And so we have this issue where children are kind of, and anyone who wants children should be able to have them, whether they can or not. So we've thought about children as being something that we are owed, something that we have a right to, something that if we can't have them biologically, that we should go outside of the norm and have them through other scientific methods. And that's ingrained in our culture now. And we know that. And a truly, you could argue that a truly pro-life culture includes people having children in any way possible, because we want more kids. And that comes right up into conflict with the Catholic idea that you are actually not owed children, which is actually a really difficult thing to explain to people. Especially someone like me who's been through that ringer, that it's possible people may not have kids, or you don't have the right to this technology. This is a cultural thing. It's a cultural argument at its core over IVF and other technologies that help us to get pregnant and to have children. So you're not really just fighting a political pro-life battle, which of course you want this incremental change. And the more pro-life I can make this culture, the more pro-life I can make this government, the better. And that's not something that can happen all at once. But we also have this question of what is next in terms of having kids? What is next in terms of selecting gender traits? What is next? What goes down the line? And Pope Benedict had amazing thoughts on the subject that many of us thought at the time when we got Dignitas Personae that he was making it up, that he was talking about designer children and eugenics and eliminating things like Down syndrome. And now we are at the point where those things are a reality. So, the Catholic Church has a very strong position on this, and we have to balance that against what we can do in the culture as it is, and how we can deal with the rest of the culture and how they feel about reproduction.
So Emily makes some great points, and you see this. I mean, Pope Benedict in one sense is prophetic. In the other sense, you can see this borne out in nations like Iceland, where Down syndrome is selected for in cases of abortion. You see this in places like India and in China, where you see definite gender selection effects. So this is without even going down the road of technological interventions like IVF. One of the things that pained me as Michigan went through this process is Michigan, at the time that Dobbs came down the pipe, had an existing statute criminalizing abortion except in the cases of preserving a mother's life. That was, I think, a 1931 statute. Courts in Michigan, when Dobbs came down the pipe, put a stay in until a constitutional amendment could be decided in this state. And the constitutional amendment basically made the right to abortion on demand part of Michigan's state constitution. All of this is happening. The Republican-controlled legislature in Michigan proposes no legislation. Then you have the most common sign that pro-life folks in Michigan were asked to put in their lines was that Proposal 3 was too confusing. That was the line to oppose what was, as anyone who read the amendment, which anyone could who came in to vote, it was not confusing. It established a right to abortion on demand in the state. There wasn't even an attempt to sort of make the argument and advance the case. And I think this is a case where you had this happen around the country. You had this happen in Kansas, where a similar constitutional amendment was enacted. Is the pro-life movement, I think, was in many ways caught off guard by the Dobbs decision. It was, they had chased the car so long that when they finally caught it, they were caught flat-footed on thinking through these issues, both philosophically and religiously, but also on the practical politics of the matter. And that's a real setback.
I want to move now to our final topic of the day, and we're going to keep it in the Catholic Church for this. I'll read to you here from an article in the New York Times from a couple days ago. Pope Francis has reiterated in a new interview that Ukraine should negotiate to end the war with Russia. But this time he used language, adopting his interviewer's expression, white flag, that has drawn attention and raised questions about whether the Pope was suggesting that Ukraine surrender. On Saturday night, the Vatican spokesman, Matteo Bruni, immediately clarified the Pope meant ceasefire and negotiation, not surrender, when he said white flag, a universal symbol for giving up. But the Pope's words and others he used during the interview have underscored how the Vatican has often bewildered Ukraine's officials and supporters struggling to understand its position. Early in the war, many Ukrainians expressed frustration with Francis for his refusal to specifically call out Russia and its president, Vladimir Putin, as the aggressor in the conflict. Francis eventually became more vocal in expressing support for what he came to call martyred Ukraine, citing Russia's aggression and praying for Ukraine's innocent victims. But the Vatican has also sought to avoid taking sides in the war, in part to preserve the possibility that it could be called on to negotiate a peace deal, a hope many geopolitical analysts consider delusional. I will note also, this is a piece from Reuters, Kremlin says appeal by Pope Francis for Ukraine talks is quite understandable. There's obviously there are things that should be thought about from a public relations perspective when making pronouncements like this. And one of them is going to be how people who are nefarious actors, and I think we can define nefarious actors as the kind of people who invade a sovereign country and try to take some of its territory, are going to use the things that you are going to say. Dan, I will throw it to you. What do you make of Pope Francis's comments about the ongoing war in Ukraine and a possible, way that it could be resolved?
So, the Pope, along with all Christians, is called to pray for peace, unreservedly, enthusiastically. However, neither the Pope nor all Christians are called as a matter of doctrine to litigate the merits or demerits of any conflict in the world. The fact that the Pope has chosen to speak so much and so strangely about the conflict in Ukraine, it's a delicate thing. As you point out, there's a trying to balance various concerns. That's a very good reason to just unreservedly pray for peace and leave it at that. You don't see the Pope trying to make the sort of statements he makes about the Ukraine, about the ongoing civil war in Sudan. I don't think that's a failure on the Pope's part. I think that is actually wisdom on the Pope's part to stay in the matter of his competency for those sort of things. The Pope is not going to be at the negotiating table of this. He's just not. Since the mid-19th century, the Pope has not been in the position to be such an arbiter, but he can be a means of directing prayer towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, and he can be a consolation to people involved in the conflict. And when you make statements like this, you deliver consternation and not consolation. And that's a very big problem. That's because that's one thing that he can deliver. And when these sorts of statements create an obstacle to that.
I think the Pope has a really important message of peace. I think we are all called to pray for peace. But I think what has dogged this Pope more than previous popes is the information age. Pope Benedict, sort of at the end of his tenure, was coming up into the social media age. Previously, though, popes have issued more specific, more professional, more obviously coalesced statements. And in this case, what happens is you have journalists who ask the Pope off the cuff what he thinks, and he says something, and then it becomes a question of what do we do with this now as Catholics? And this has happened very often in Pope Francis's tenure. And that's not to say that he's necessarily wrong in all of these, but these are also off-the-cuff statements from the Pope. And we've probably never in the history of the Catholic Church have had someone who has been tailed so ferociously by journalists, but also at the same time has had every single one of his statements dissected and placed on social media and discussed in ways that, previous popes have not. So in this case, the official position of the Catholic Church is going to have to be put up against our own just war theory and saying, does Ukraine have a right to defend itself? Absolutely. Does it have to surrender? No. Is Russia's position in this conflict just? Probably. He says the same things about Israel and Gaza. The Pope's job is to say we should be at peace and we should all be happy and we should be praying praying for peace in our world. But, sometimes these things just get said. There's no real way to take them back. The white flag is a big deal. That signals surrender, not negotiation. So I think the Vatican is having a difficult time because, people just say things and they may not be the Catholic Church's official position. And we kind of have to wrestle with that.
I think Emily makes a really good point about the information age, and Francis has has lived through that in a way that only he possibly could, because a lot of these. This is one of the things I make a point generally about social media whenever we talk about it, which is all of this stuff is still really young, and we have not lived with it for a very long period of time. So that is not to dismiss the concerns that people have about its implications on mental health, particularly rises in suicide rates among young girls. I think all of these things are to be taken very seriously, but there is just kind of an acclamation to the existence of something and a figuring out how to live with it that we just haven't had a lot of time to do. And I think you see this represented in the way that we see a lot of stories about this, and certainly a lot more stories about Pope Francis than we had about his predecessors, even though, as Emily points out, there was some overlap in the digital information age and Pope Benedict prior to Pope Francis. But you got a lot fewer stories than you've seen about you get versions of has Pope Francis completely changed the Catholic Church's position on gay marriage? And you actually read the comments and it's like, yeah, he was a little less than eloquent in the way that he was presenting us, and this does seem to be a problem for this Pope, that he is less eloquent and speaks off the cuff, as Emily was pointing out. There are more opportunities to do it, but he also seems to handle it generally not so well, at least by my lights and my observation. And it puts them in a position where they have to do a lot of this kind of clarifying. And it comes down to the question of, I hate to think about these in such kind of like, awful, greasy ways, but from like a political campaign perspective, it's a question of message discipline, right? The Pope has a message to deliver, and he should be delivering that message consistently in all conversations he gives. You don't adopt your interviewer's language when answering a question. So adopting white flag is just something that somebody shouldn't do. And if it at some point needs to become a question for the Vatican that if the Pope is going to be in the media as much as he is and doing interviews like this as much as he is, he needs to be better at it. Like, I don't know any other way to say that other than to say that he just needs to be better at it and not create these opportunities for people to start interpreting and reinterpreting the things that he has said. If he can be consistent in saying that, there should be peace, we should be praying for peace, he should be the Pope. He doesn't need to be a geopolitical analyst, and he doesn't need to be a foreign policy advisor that is trying to figure out the best way to bring about peace and what that process should look like. He should be a voice of moral clarity. And I think the deeper he gets into trying to answer these more policy-oriented, process-oriented questions, I think is where you start getting into problems of interpretation and misinterpretation.
The Vatican itself is a little behind the times in terms of communication too, and that has made things difficult because you look at even areas of Catholic concern like fiducia supplicans and its interpretations, and you see issues with how it's applied by Catholics and how it's interpreted by Catholics. And is it a change? Is it not a change? We don't know because the Vatican has such difficulty with communication. So I think it's just, sort of endemic to the Vatican. And when it comes to something like this, it causes global problems because at the same time as he shouldn't be speaking on these issues, he's also a recognized global leader and a moral leader. So we have this sort of like, maybe we just need to rehire the Vatican Communication Office.
All the more reason for clarity when he speaks.
So one of the problems here is, and part of this is social media, part of this is, all of these different avenues for communication, is the Pope has venues on which he can address subjects that he is concerned about, that he believes the people of God should be concerned about. Those are in regular homilies that he gives. Those are in encyclicals that he can author. Those are through, there are official Vatican publishing houses, all of this stuff. You really, religious leaders of all stripes today should be calling people to greater attention and addressing people in context, as Michael Miller likes to put out, as embodied, embedded persons. And not as clips from interviews and not from tweets. They should be calling them into a richer form of dialogue. And, that's going to involve maybe updating the Vatican website. It's pretty terrible. But there's low-hanging fruit there. And the church has historic means in which the Pope addresses the wider church, and it should be pushing those. It should be pushing the latest papal homily. It should not be preoccupied with trying to add context to the latest media interview clip.
Let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Acton Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look right now in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Acton Unwind, or just search Acton Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this show. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Emily. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.